Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is a rebuilt 440. Or at least it was. Now it's my next tear down and look for carnage project. You may have noticed this, but I've been tearing down a lot of engines lately. Here's another one now. I didn't even bother filming that one. For some reason, I'm currently building or waiting to build 9 different Chrysler engines. 2 426 Hemis, 2 273s, 1 318, 1 360, a 318 Poly sometime soon, and 2 440s for some reason. Oh, and a slant 6, so I guess it's 10. Anyway, the story on this engine is it was rebuilt for a Charger like 20-something years ago, and it's just been sitting around. Now, another company was putting this car together, and they decided to try and fire the engine up. It made a horrible, horrible noise, so they shut it down and pulled it back out of the car, and now it's here for me to figure out. I wish I'd been there to hear this thing running because it probably would have been really impressive. It may be hard for you to hear this, but turning the engine over with the breaker bar, you can feel it jumping, and you can just barely hear like a clicky noise. It's very subtle though. It just feels weird. One possibility we considered is sitting for years and years with some kind of assembly lube in there. It could have hardened, and that could have grabbed a bearing and spun it when they finally tried to start this thing. Or who knows what. Let's get in there and figure it out. This is kind of one of those modernish, pro touring-ish sorts of builds. This is one of those CVF serpentine drive accessory kits. I've already taken the liberty of removing that. It's huge. I'm really not a fan of this modernish stuff, but I will say it was really easy to remove this. Actually, because it was missing a bolt. There were only 3 long bolts holding all of this to the engine. So I took the belt off, removed those, and off it came. That is kind of nice. It's also kind of janky, but anyway. I've never seen Finn spark plug wire holders like this before. Of course, we've got the obligatory Mopar Performance cast aluminum valve covers, which I love. It's got an HEI module, a Dyna mod, which I've never heard of. It's mounted to this trick little aluminum heatsink, which is attached to one valley pan bolt. Very nifty. The distributor is just a stock remanufactured Chrysler unit. Thank you. Oh, you'll notice this thing's still dangling from the picker. We're currently experiencing a lack of engine stands around here. At least this thing's halfway clean. Unlike that 273 I took apart earlier. That thing's gross. In spite of that, it's actually in very nice shape. There's one totally loose valve cover bolt. Okay. Of course, as I go, I'm bagging and tagging the hardware. I'd hate to lose important 440 bolts. How do you like the floating 71 Roadrunner in the background? I think it's kind of cool. Stock things. All right, these appear to be brand new reproduction rocker shafts and rockers. Nice new hardware. I do notice the valve springs are very stock, just single wire, no damper, no nothing. I see nice positive seals in there, but yeah, this is looking pretty low power to me. This thing is going to live in front of a 4-speed in that Charger, which is awesome. I've already taken the liberty of removing the bell housing, which did come attached to the engine. Now I'll remove this center force clutch. This one does not have the ring of weights here. I've never seen a center force that didn't before, so that's interesting. Oh yes, in case you were wondering, storing things in Connex boxes, probably not a good idea. This was new. I'm assuming they ran it with water in it. Up on the ID pad of this engine, it says C440, which means 1967. The casting date here says 6/15/66, so that makes sense. Now the good news is this seems to be a complete original 67 engine. It has the 67 only 915 casting number heads. These are actually a closed chamber. There's a lot of blue under the orange on this engine, which is kind of weird. Originally, this thing would have been turquoise. Also, it has a C-body pan. You may notice it's got later type spool engine mounts. That's because this thing's going on an altercation K-frame. 2 things. First, that was the most solidly attached oil pan I've ever seen in my life. And that includes the Hemi pan I tried to remove last week that still had 2 bolts in it. Also, good thing it didn't just fall off because that pan is completely full of oil. That's right, they went to great lengths to get all the coolant out, but they left all the oil in the sump. And of course I couldn't check it because there was no dipstick. I probably should have just automatically pulled the plug, but I didn't. So now I'm gonna drain it. All right, there's definitely some stuff in there, but maybe it's assembly lube. Maybe it's little bits of oil with moisture. Don't see any big chunks yet. I think this thing only ran for like a few seconds, so I wouldn't expect to see too much destruction in here. I don't know why I always get into these projects right at go-home time, but I guess we're gonna have to wait until tomorrow to see what delights await inside that oil pan. Brr. It's the next day, and the 440 seems to be done dripping. Also, in case you were wondering, yes, I did test the fortitude of our cherry picker overnight. It passed. I've got the pan down finally, and there's some interesting stuff in here. Most notably that, which looks like sand, actually. Okay, so remember that whole totally stuck thing? I tried gently prying this tray down, but it just wasn't happening. So it looks like this now, and it's finally off of the engine. We will be installing one of those Moroso O-ringed plastic windage tray thingies, so anyway, there's some magic goo sitting on this tray. It's either peanut butter or aged assembly lube. Well, now I'm in the guts of this thing, and so far I don't see anything obvious. No rod nuts falling out, no broken, destroyed, twisted metal. Snacks appeared as if by magic. I did go through and try to wiggle each rod by hand to check for movement, and I couldn't detect any. I'm gonna point the camera up in here, clunk the crank back and forth, and see if we can see what's going on. If not, I'll just start tearing things apart. Okay, would you stop? Of course, all the tools I need rolled away across the floor. As I mentioned, there's a distinct feeling of like a jump in the crank's movement. And it's right there. Right there. This thing's dancing around everywhere, so it might be really hard to see what's going on, but I'll review the footage anyway. Yeah, I don't see anything loose in the bottom end. So what I'm gonna do now is back off these rocker shafts because I suspect we might have a valve contact issue. I've got the shafts loose, but obviously not removed. The valve should still kind of move, at least until all the push rods fall out. So I'm gonna rock the crank back and forth again and see if that weird jumping feeling is gone. That made no difference at all. Okay, not a valve contact issue. My next thought is a wrist pin, and because the noise seems to be coming from like this area, that would make some sense. The only other thing that comes to mind is piston to head contact, given that these are closed chamber heads and we don't know what kind of pistons are in here. I doubt they're sticking up out of the holes though. It seems really unlikely. Obviously, to get in and confirm that, I've got to remove literally everything. So let's do that. Removing the oil pickup, I didn't have to start backing it off with a pair of vice grips. It's possible to damage them doing that. Of course, we insist on a new one of these for every build regardless. I don't know if this is an actual thing worth worrying about, but I have noticed there's not an amazing amount of oil up here at the top end. There is some oil, but not a lot. Oh, I did notice these TTI header gaskets. Notice the gigantic, generous exhaust ports on these compared to what's on this head. I don't use these. I use Remflex. Remflex is so much better. Oh, apparently this brand new fancy positive seal leaks, so that's cool. Wanted to point something else out to you. Do you see those hard edges in there? Someone had exhaust valve seats put in these heads. That's not all that uncommon. There's a fear that heads from before the time of unleaded fuel will have issues with sinking exhaust valves. I've actually never seen this on any Chrysler product. Well, except for a slant six once. Someone put seats in this thing, and they are not nicely finished at all. You see this one? It's actually extended fully into the exhaust port. There are ugly hard edges everywhere. Yeah, so I'm gonna insist on breaking these heads down. That's just terrible. I don't know if I pointed this out. This is the fuel feed line coming from the pump and going to the carburetor. It's run underneath the intake, which certainly cleans things up in this area, but I don't know if that's a great idea. As usual, the world is my engine stand today because they're all full. If there's one thing I love in life, it's hitting shiny new parts with a hammer. A disgusting hammer. I always prefer to use percussive maintenance instead of prying things off if at all possible. As you can see, this is a very nice Edelbrock Performer RPM intake. The reason it's kind of shiny is because it was clear coated to protect the bare aluminum, and it's probably a good thing they did that. If they hadn't, it would be all powdery and horrible like every other little bit of bare metal on this engine. Anyway, as you can see here, it actually has the paper gaskets under the intake. Now, I never use these unless I have like a fitment issue, then I can use the paper gasket as a shim. I'll generally just surround the ports with a very thin coating of silicone and put the intake directly on the valley pan. Now the valley tray is well affixed to the block with silicone, and I always do that too. Unfortunately, to take it off, it's gonna end up twisted and destroyed, just like the windage tray, but probably worse. So I know I pointed out there's like sand in the oil pan. There's also more sand sitting in the valley. Got all the push rods out and I noticed they make like weird crunchy noises when you rub them on each other. And I think it's because they're covered in sand. Everything in this engine needs a serious cleaning. I think this is the nicest looking engine I've ever worked on. It's gonna be a real shame when I ruin it. Did you know that early 440s are missing a couple bolt bosses here that were added on to later 440s? That's because the A body used a wraparound mount that connected to the block right here. I've got the driver's odd side head off. You can see here what makes this 915 head special. That's the flat pad in the chamber. That's why these are known as closed chamber, because instead of being a complete open hole, it's partially closed. Also, number 3 was full of water. Well, not full of water, but the intake valve or the exhaust valve must have been open and moisture got in there, and it's terrible. Here's a first look at one of these pistons. I don't know, again, how far up out of the hole these come just yet. They are nice looking. They have little eyebrow valve reliefs there, which are asymmetrical and interesting looking. Also, chunks in this one. That is a piece of metal. Like, it looks like a bit of weld. And it looks like that could have been a noise. Look at the divots that made in the chamber right there. It's not nearly as bad as the piston, but it's not pretty. There's a bit of debris in number 7 here, but I'm sure it just fell out of this port, which, like the rest of the cooling system bits I can see, is absolutely disgusting. Yeah, you can see that bit of weld slag or whatever it is was doing a little tap dance on top of this piston. Somehow, that is not the noise. Listen to this now that I've got the block secured and sitting on the ground. That is quite something, actually. So we'll keep going, looking for more nightmares. Got the other head off and found something way worse than number 3. Number 8 here is, yeah, it's seen some stuff. Look at this chunk of metal bouncing around in that cylinder. I don't know what it is. It's interesting. I think it started life out flat, and it appears to have had some kind of coating on it. Now it looks like this, and I'm sure that's from valve contact. Interestingly enough, there's actually a tiny piece of it here in number 2 as well. Now this piston has not seen as much horrible tap dancing of metal, but there are little marks in it. It's definitely seen some things. Yeah, that right there is not ideal. What do you think of this awful rusty goo in the coolant passage? I kind of like it. I'm sure it's obvious that I have no idea how those bits of debris got in these cylinders. I can only imagine it had something to do with sitting around for years. It must have had no cover on the intake or something. That or little bits of debris were dropped in the intake manifold before it was installed, or little bits of debris were dropped down the intake ports. On that number 3 piston, I'm pretty confident I could sand the little divots, and as long as the ring gland isn't damaged, we could probably run that. This, I'm not so sure. What's really interesting here is somehow the main area it was contacting was up at the top, which means it was like being blown up here by pressure somehow or pulled up by vacuum. I'm not sure, but it's really interesting. Pulling the lifters out now. Of course, I will be saving these in order in a box. In all likelihood, we will reuse this cam and we'll need the lifters to go back where they were. As I'm pulling them, I'll be checking each face for wear. Of course, this thing barely ran, so I wouldn't expect to see much just yet. Kind of interesting. There's a little nick in that face. It's not all that uncommon. I've got the harmonic balancer pulled off. Now I can get this timing cover out of the way. Okay, that wasn't so bad. Notice this is a dual row roller style timing chain. It does have the standard single bolt retainer instead of the 3 bolt found on the Hemi, the 6-pack, and other aftermarket performance setups. Also, this is a 3-way adjustable chain. Note the different keyways on the crank gear there. This appears to be a ton of Loctite. Sure smells like Loctite. I mean, it kind of slowed the impact down, but it sure didn't hold the bolt in there like you'd expect red Loctite to hold it. These crank gears are generally a tight press fit, and I'll use like a brass drift or something to install them. Whoever did this one used something a little bit more destructive, maybe a steel punch. Here's our fuel pump driving push rod. These are a huge pain to work with if you don't know, and it's a common spot for wear. I'll be leaving this one in the block for now anyway. Time to pull the camshaft. I've threaded an old head bolt into that. I'll carefully pull it out, and then I'll use my other hand to guide the back of the cam through the bearings. With any luck, they'll be reusable. It kind of depends on what happens to this block though. If it takes an acid bath, it'll get new cam bearings regardless. I had guessed this was a comp, and I think I threw out the number 268H. Well, close. CC for comp cams. 260H. Of course, the camera won't focus on that, but there you go. I've put multiple 268Hs in 383s over the years, so in the 440, this is pretty mild. I could go look up the specs, but it's nothing radical anyway. Of course, if you've watched the channel much, or any modern engine building videos really, you probably know that comp cams aren't necessarily what you want to buy. Thankfully, this one's like 20 years old, and I'm not really afraid of running it again. I got the crank timing gear pulled off with some heat from a small torch and the careful application of a pry bar. Note you've got your 3 positions here, and as is indicated on the gear there, the advance and retard spots are both 2 degrees. And then you've got your straight up marking here. Using this, you can tweak the installed angle of your cam ever so slightly. A bit of advance tends to favor low end torque, while retarding the cam slightly tends to favor high RPM horsepower. I haven't pointed out this silly tiny oil filter yet. I don't know why they use that. Maybe for clearance around the goofy accessories, but sure looked like there was more room than this. You should be able to fit a Wix 51515 or comparable different brand filter on there. It's much taller and much wider. It was tight, but it wasn't super tight. It may surprise you to learn that there are many different filters that will fit in the same locations as various others. But let it be noted that the sealing diameter on this one was definitely on the small side for the big block Chrysler. That barely works. I've got the engine back in, park bench overhaul position, and I'm pulling out the pistons one by one. Here's number 2. It's just the first one I got out for some reason. Notice this is an interesting piston design. It has a high top ring and a big gap between the two. It's KB, which you can tell by the way it says KB. It's got a centered pin, which is typical of an aftermarket piston. And although it does have grooves for clips, which could be used to set this up as a floater, where the pin is not pressed into the rod, this one is pressed into the rod. There's no bushing. This is a factory 440 rod, so the piston moves on the pin, and the pin does not move in the rod. The reason for using bushings like that, having floating pins, is of course a little bit less resistance, less friction. But anyway, for a low power engine, it's not a big deal. These rods do appear to have been reconditioned. You can see the nice cross-hatching from the hone that the big end got there. That's called resizing. The machine shop will take a little bit of material off of the flats there, and same on the rod cap, and then they'll torque the bolts down and use a hone to resize the big end of the rod to the factory specification. Note, the top piston ring does not appear shiny. I think this is just a regular cast iron ring. Now, of course, number 2 had some debris in it as well, and it looks like it was in there when it was running. You can see the damage there right at the bottom, and there are random little pock marks all over. It's nothing like number 8 or even number 3, but there is some damage. The biggest concern with that, when there's something impacting the top of a piston, is that it'll crush this entire face and constrict the ringland. The ringland, of course, is the groove there that the ring lives in. It seems to me that this one is okay. The ring moves freely in it, so this piston I'm sure would fly. These KBs did not have a size marker on the top, but if you look inside here, there is a marking that says 030. So this is a 30 over 440 piston. Also note, these are ARP rod fasteners, the stud and the matching nut. You can tell at a glance that these aren't factory nuts because of the built-in washers. Factory nuts are just plain nuts. Remember that thing I said about the ringlands a minute ago, where the biggest concern would be crushing the top of the piston and causing the ring to get stuck? This is number 3, the first one I found a chunk in, and that is exactly what happened. Look at this. The ring is perfectly pinched in that location. It didn't move at all until I wiggled it a bit, so it is moving now. You could get all fancy and try to clean that groove up and get the ring moving freely again, but at the end of the day, it's not good. The structural integrity of this piston has been compromised. Also, full disclosure, there was water in there and the ring is all rusty and horrible as well, but even this nasty rusty patch bit moves freely in the piston. This does not. Got number 4 out. The skirt to wall clearance on this one seemed really tight. Like, it didn't come out smoothly. It dragged in the bore. I saved the best for last. Number 8. This is actually interesting because unlike number 3, the ringland is not crushed. The top ring moves freely, no problem. That's in spite of seeing all of that. And even up here at the top where that piece was bouncing somehow, it's messed up, but it didn't crush the ringland. If one was extremely thrifty, one could try and sand this down or maybe even have it milled, but then it wouldn't match the other ones and you'd still have all those little pock marks unless you go like really deep. The biggest issue here, aside from being ugly, is every one of those little pock marks that has a sharp edge around it or on it or a little bit of material sticking up, that is an opportunity for a hot spot to develop, which can lead to detonation, pre-ignition, or pinging. That'll just create even more damage, wreak havoc on this piston, and do bad stuff. Again, if you were super thrifty, you could try and save this. We're just not gonna do that. We try and do nice work around here, usually. The right thing to do is to throw these away and get new ones. I was just furnished paperwork on the rebuild and machining from when this engine was done. And there was a line item in there for machining pistons. So I went and looked. This KB 184, I think it is actually still available, although it has a coated skirt now. It has valve reliefs just like this, and it's supposed to have a raised pad at the top. Because this thing has closed chamber heads, they machined off those pads to create a flat piston. What that means, of course, is we can't just go out and buy a set of the same pistons because they aren't going to fit. I'm sure we're going to have options available. The hope is, because this thing is already at a fresh 30 thou over bore, we should be able to keep it there and just get another set of pistons. I'll give it a quick cleanup hone and it'll go back together. Or that's what I would do. But in this case, the customer actually wants the block cleaned correctly and all of the paint stripped off so it can be fully restored factory style. I'm fine with that. It could use a good cleaning. It's full of sand for some reason. Speaking of interesting machining, I was admiring this. There was a lot of weight removed from this front counterweight, and it's just like flat. I've never seen that before. Anyway, I'm down to just the crank now. I need to pull this thing out, and then I'll be all done. And the crankshaft is finally liberated. Looks great. This doesn't need anything. Again, this is a fresh 1010 undersize. I feel really good about that. But when we get the pistons changed, we are going to have the reciprocating assembly balanced again, so this will be going to the machine shop anyway. The main bearings look great. I'm assuming we'll just be reusing those. Now the heads are going to go to the machine shop too, mostly for a cleaning and probably specking out new valve springs. But before that happens, I'm going to break them down, at least clean them part way, and I have got to ground down those hard edges around the exhaust seats. That's just silly. While I'm at it, I'll knock down any factory imperfections, like that one, and just give them the mildest of cleanups. I did go look at the cam card for the Comp 260H. It's 440 lift, which is kind of funny, and 220 duration at 050, 222? I don't know, it's not very much. If this was my 440, it would be getting something ridiculous like, I don't know, a 509 purple shaft. Again, this isn't supposed to be some nutso horsepower build. Anyway, I'll be taking the heads back to the North Pole with me tonight. I'll get those broken down. The rest of this stuff will go to the machine shop. Maybe next week. We'll see. We're not exactly in a hurry on this one. There's a kind of a line. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed all that. Look forward to future episodes in which we put it all back together. And hopefully we don't fill it with chunks. Until then, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, that's just bad. It's bad. Don't do that.